It's always an interesting day when a billionaire governor like J.B. Pritzker decides to cosplay as a man of the people. So reacting, as many of you might have seen, to Trump's deployment of the National Guard in D.C. and his threats to do the same in Chicago, Pritzker delivered a line that was practically dripping with manufactured outrage. Take a look. If it sounds to you like I'm an alarmist, that is because I am ringing an alarm. Such a deployment is exactly the type of overreach that our country's founders warned us against. What President Trump is doing is unprecedented and unwarranted. It is illegal, it is unconstitutional, and it is un-American. Yet another billionaire leading into the tired tropes of liberal nationalism because, what, he's the governor of a major state and claims about white guys who have been dead for 200 years is all he's got? But it's the same playbook as the right, isn't it? Right? Invoke the sainted founders, pretend they're on your side, and then call the other side un-American. It's a script so predictable it's become profoundly boring, and the other side's better at it anyway. But setting aside some really tired rhetoric, is he right? Yes. And no. It all depends on who you are. Hey folks, I'm Tad Sturmer. I'm a scholar of American history at the University of Southern Denmark and the author of A Resistance History of the United States, coming to you next year from Steerforth Press and Penguin Random House. If you're white, and especially if you're part of the wealthy establishment like Pritzker, then yeah, he's absolutely right. Yes, from your perspective, Trump's actions are profoundly un-American. Why? Because you are the people this country was built for. You are the people for whom the Constitution was written. In a very real sense, you are America. So when state power is turned against your interests, sure, it feels like a betrayal, an overreach. It gets the liberal nationalists every time. They come pounding into Substack about this stuff. They come out of the woodwork. The irony, though, is that in his defense of America, Pritzker is invoking the arguments of the Constitution's greatest opponents, the Anti-Federalists. Mostly the old revolutionaries like Samuel Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, the people, men and women, who made the revolution of 1775. They were the ones who warned about a powerful executive and an overreaching central government, but not about the British, about the American nationalists pushing the Constitution. The founders, Pritzker is citing, weren't the ones who won the debate and wrote the Constitution. They were the ones who lost, who saw this exact potential for tyranny baked into the Constitution as they wrote it, as it was adopted. But if you're not white, then Pritzker is dead wrong. What Trump did is not the kind of overreach the founders warned us about, because the founders built the system to do exactly this. It's not unprecedented, it is not unconstitutional, and it sure as hell isn't un-American. The abusive system is operating just as it was designed, of, by, and for particular Americans. 2025 is partying just like it's 1825. And to really get at this, we have to lay down our value statements and look past the sanitized civics class version of the Constitution. Forget the preamble for a moment. The Constitution was, objectively, in that moment, an act of consolidating power in the hands of a few to create and protect a white ethno-state. That's not a modern critique, it's not some sort of revision, it's a correction to a generation of garbage history to get back to how it was understood at the time. We the people meant them, the white, propertied men in the room. They weren't thinking about anyone else, they weren't even considering you. That's what being a republic is all about. I will not be taking questions on that. And how did they get the new government in their way? Well, they did exactly what Trump is doing right now. They invented a crisis to push forward their nationalist goals. Crisis? Shays Rebellion. We're taught it was a chaotic uprising of debtor farmers threatening to tear the young country apart. That it was, well, a rebellion. It wasn't. The reality is that it was a protest movement in Western Massachusetts grounded in the very same principle as the American Revolution, the exact same one, no taxation without representation. Farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were losing their land to foreclosure because of tax policies passed by a state legislature that ignored their petitions. The taxes were too high. They were favoring the merchants in Boston rather than the farmers in the Berkshires. Now, when their representatives refused to hear their arguments, threw them away, they did what the Patriots did in 1775. They stepped outside the permitted avenues and shut down the courts that were trying to take their homes and farms, the only way they could pay the taxes at all, away from them. That, of course, terrified the new establishment, many of whom were the same patriots who had just overthrown British authority. And it seemed for them, all that was just to install their own authority. Threaten Britain? Heroic. Threaten them? Anarchy. So they call out the militia. They ask neighboring states for help. They beg the Confederation Congress to intervene. But that Congress, operating under the Articles of Confederation, said, no, can't. The Articles were not weak. This is part of the narrative, and it's not true. The Articles were not weak. They're just designed to do something else. They're only weak if you are, say it with me now, a nationalist, valuing that consolidated, centralized authority. But at the time, most of the patriots were fine with what they had achieved through independence for their states, their own little countries. So the Congress had no authority to deploy a military force for what was essentially a minor internal dispute. Some property had been damaged, but no one had yet been hurt. The resistors stayed focused. That's where the nationalists, men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, saw their chance. They turned a local tax protest on legitimate grounds, narrowly focused on the issue they were protesting, into an existential nationalist crisis. There were Shayites everywhere, in every state, just waiting to tear apart the fabric of government. They fanned those flames, lying about unruly criminal mobs everywhere, inspired by this boogeyman of Daniel Shays. And they're rising up all over the place, threatening to destroy the Republic today, right now. The threat was imminent, they insisted. The nation was failing. It was in the name of rebellion, a grab for power. Folks, their taxes were too high, and the Massachusetts legislature didn't listen to them when they tried to tell them that. And the state moved to take their homes for them. That's not rebellion, that's resistance, and resistance for survival. In the best tradition of the American Revolution, by veterans who had fought for it, and it wasn't happening anywhere else. The Anti-Federalists point this out in ratification debate after ratification debate. There is no evidence of that in Virginia, in North Carolina, in New York, any place. It's only there in Massachusetts for that moment. Doesn't matter. It scared the establishment. It terrified George Washington and John Adams. So the nationalists manufactured fear. And that powerful dynamic is what made the difference between a failed Annapolis Convention in 1786 and a successful Philadelphia Convention in 1787. The nationalists hammered home their argument that without a powerful, centralized government capable of deploying troops at home against its own people, it would all fall apart, without any evidence that that was the case. But they had the fear. In the end, the Massachusetts militia did march west, and in that conflict that followed, people were killed, but not by the protesters, but by the forces of the state through, get this, a privately financed force that opened fire on Shays resistors, killing 4 of them. And the playbook was written: seize on a convenient lie, stoke fears to create a fake crisis, use the panic to justify an authoritarian overreach, codify that overreach into law and practice, and then make it all patriotic. Whew. That's how we get the Constitution. So no, Governor Pritzker, this isn't un-American. It's one of the primary reasons the Constitution exists in the first place. Now, as the Anti-Federalists correctly pointed out, the Constitution gave the new president more power than a British king had wielded in over a century, with no real checks and balances. They argued against that power in state after state during the ratification debates, and every amendment they proposed to curb that power was defeated. The version of the Bill of Rights they did manage to force through in the first federal Congress did almost nothing to protect Americans from the power of the federal government until the 14th Amendment was passed 80 years later. And what about its use since? Is it un-American to do it, made unconstitutional or even illegal? No, it's been used pretty regularly, and not too different in a way than this. For most of American history, the coercive authority of the state, including the federalization of militia and National Guard, has been deployed to protect the interests of establishment white people against, well, everyone else, against organized labor. Okay, so when miners in Colorado organized for better conditions, the Colorado National Guard was called in. The result was the Ludlow Massacre of 1914. Where guardsmen attacked a tent colony of striking miners, killing 24 people, including women and children. Federal troops were also used to brutally crush the Pullman strike in 1894. The enemy wasn't a foreign power, it was American workers demanding a living wage. of course, against black Americans. The National Guard has a long and sordid history here. Where do you even begin? Well, maybe we can go at least with the progressive era, with the end of Reconstruction, the Wilmington coup of 1898, or maybe the Tulsa race massacre in 1921, when Oklahoma National Guardsmen called in and instead of stopping a white supremacist mob, they enabled them to do more damage by disarming and arresting black residents, leaving them defenseless as Black Wall Street was burned to the ground. And during the Civil Rights era, Southern governors like George Wallace repeatedly used the Guard to enforce segregation, while presidents used the same institution to enforce desegregation in places like Little Rock. The Guard was a tool of raw executive power used for whatever purpose the man in charge saw fit. Just because some presidents used it in a handful of cases for protected groups rather than against them just goes to show that there are no limits or guides at all. It's just based upon the whim of the person in charge. And of course, it's been used against Indigenous peoples. The Army's campaign against Native Americans is pretty well known, but we all need to know about massacres like Wounded Knee in 1890. And that dynamic continued, sort of Wounded Knee in 1973. The standoff between the American Indian movement and the government involved federal marshals, FBI agents, and the National Guard, turning a protest into a military siege. That's just small examples, folks, from suppressing urban uprisings in the 1960s to confronting protesters right now, today. The pattern's pretty clear. The state's monopoly on violence is rarely used to protect the vulnerable and almost always used to protect the powerful. But surely there are laws against this, you might ask. Well, that's where the story gets even a bit more grim. The primary law restricting the use of the military for domestic law enforcement is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. It sounds good, but it's just riddled with exceptions. The biggest loophole is the Insurrection Act of 1807. That act, passed by another frightened founder, Thomas Jefferson, scared that his own vice president, Aaron Burr, might launch his own resistance, gives the president broad powers to deploy both active duty military and the federalized National Guard domestically to suppress whatever the president deems is an insurrection or domestic violence or a conspiracy that obstructs the law. The language leaves the decision almost entirely to the president's discretion, and that's the basis for most modern interpretations of executive authority, and why so many of the challenges to it are not being upheld today. So presidents have used that law sparingly, but they have used it. Eisenhower in Little Rock, JFK in Mississippi, Johnson during the riots of the 1960s, George Herbert Walker Bush 1 during the 1992 LA riots. Congress has occasionally tried to tweak it, but the core power remains intact. Legal challenges, they're rare, they're difficult. The courts have been historically deferential to the executive branch on matters of national security and public order. And you think that this court's going to be any different given what they have already done? The legal guardrails that Pritzker imagines are really, they're more like painted lines on the road. So when a president decides to drive over them, there's nothing to stop him. The legality of those actions has never really been meaningfully tested by the Supreme Court. And now they're going to be. They'll clarify it, but you're not going to want to see what they come up with. It doesn't look good. So what does Pritzker actually mean when he rings his alarm bell? Who's he speaking for? Well, in the end, he's talking about himself, as usual with the Democratic Party leadership, a wealthy white member of the American power establishment. For his class, the idea of president unilaterally deploying troops to impose his will is a terrifying violation of the norms that protect them. He's right to be alarmed for his own little world. But for the rest of America, for the descendants of enslaved people, for indigenous people dispossessed of their land, for the immigrants who built the railroads, and for the workers whose bodies were broken to create the wealth of men like Pritzker and Trump, it's nothing new. It's not an aberration. It's very American and probably very constitutional. And this is precisely why Pritzker's alarmism, for all of its fiery passion, is so profoundly dangerous as a matter of resistance history. It anesthetizes opposition. By framing Trump as a uniquely unconstitutional actor, right, a monster who's broken free of his cage, it creates this comforting illusion that the cage itself is still strong. It suggests that if we can just get rid of this one man, if we can put everything back into the cage, everything will magically snap back into place and normalcy will return. But Trump isn't breaking the Constitution. He's, the ghost in the machine. He's the inevitable outcome, certainly, of a system that concentrates immense power in the executive. What he's really done is reveal the fatal flaws that are there all along, demonstrating the absolute necessity for fundamental change. Yes, that means a new constitution, a new power structure. We can do better. And that is a conclusion that men like Pritzker cannot afford to have you reach. By focusing your attention on the man, on Trump, the establishment works to ensure you won't ever turn your attention to them and a flawed blueprint of the system that guarantees their place at the table. And that's just what the history shows. That's the pattern. So where does that leave us? Well, the first step is to stop cosplaying an America that never was and start thinking about the America that could be. The shared nostalgic fantasy on the right and left for those nationalists where founders are flawless and the system is just serves only the powerful of both. Let the right and the establishment center left have their airbrushed history, their gauzy nostalgia, their enslaver heroes. While they're lost in the past, the rest of us, Democrats, Republicans, independents, can actually learn the hard lessons of our real history and move forward to create something better. This work puts the responsibility squarely on us to make this country into the place we know it can be. It means we must demand of the people who want to be our leaders, especially now, an actual vision for what we need to do and what can come next, not just a promise to restore a past that was never great for most of us.